G'day again all, it's just Ben, just here to keep continuing with our video series of seafood safety, and today, or for this lesson, you might have read seen through more than one lesson today, possibly. Today we're going to be talking about the ideas that underpin a HACCP program. Alright, now HACCP is all about managing the risks associated with seafood safety, and it initially was developed by a group of military scientists or military strategists. I can't remember which one they are, but it stemmed from the need to protect astronauts in space realistically, and partly from their food, to prevent their food from crumbling up and causing problems with their instruments and things within space, but also about protecting the integrity of the food, particularly with things related to bacteria and fungus and so on and so forth, to prevent them from getting sick in space. Alright, so what is HACCP? Apart from the fact that it looks like a stupid term, it's actually hazard analysis and critical control points, and it is pronounced, believe it or not, as HACCP. Alright, now, the whole aim about HACCP is to be proactive, I think is the term we've got there, about predicting issues or problems or challenges that we might suffer in the processing chain. And in relation to the seafood industry, we're talking about traceability standards, or the ability for us to maintain a safe product from harvest or capture to the end user, which is going to be you when you walk into the supermarket or the restaurant to eat it. Sometimes we call it the processing chain, sometimes it's the cold chain. Depends on how you want to go about it, but realistically that's what we're talking about when we're talking about HACCP, is trying to protect the integrity of the product throughout its life cycle reality. Alright, so HACCP identifies any problem that could occur and doesn't do it, but we put controls in place to make sure that the issue that we identify, or a group of issues that we identify, don't get out of hand, and hopefully we can mitigate those risks before they even become an issue, before we even set a plan in place. Alright, so there's no point having a plan or a way of doing something without being able to monitor it. So inside the HACCP we build in monitoring systems or KPIs or reference indicators, whatever you want to call it, to be able to monitor each step within the processing chain. So an example of that is temperature. We discussed earlier about using temperature as a means to control bacteria. Now, we did discuss that there is a finite temperature that we want to try and achieve, and it's below 4 degrees if we're trying to market our product as fresh product. If it's frozen, then it becomes frozen product, but obviously freezing in that point in time also helps to control risks associated with bacterial development and subsequent disease. Alright, so where do we do it? Alright, there's bundles of points, and inside each of those points there is going to be a bundle of other critical points, we should say, that should be embedded inside to the process. So we've got issues related to harvesting, transporting, purging, slaughtering, filleting, skinning, grading, chilling, holding, packaging and transporting. Now, purging is a important one. Right, it's one that actually pops up quite a bit in the oyster industry. All of our oysters need to be purged for a period of time, depending on what's been happening in the environment. And an example of that happened in Tasmania about, God knows, probably maybe about 2013, I think it was. There was quite a considerable outbreak, or an issue with some oysters that were sold to the public, I guess you would say, or to the consumer, that were infected or contracted the E. coli strain of bacteria, and it obviously ended up causing sickness. So what part of that issue was, we had an overflow of a sewage treatment plant, I believe, that ended up into the river system that was fed into the oyster farm. Alright, and then the oyster farm didn't detect those levels of E. coli early enough, and subsequently those oysters were passed on to the end user, and the end user got sick. So if the purging system had been used correctly, if they had picked up that there was E. coli in the system, and the oysters may have had it, the purging system should have been able to purge the E. coli out of the system, or it would have enabled the animals to run the course of E. coli, run it down to the point where the levels of it would be insignificant in terms of human consumption. We'll step through that, maybe use that as an example through this. So stage 1 of the HACCP process is to identify potential hazards associated with all stages of the activity until the point of consumption, or what we would call the end product. Alright, there must be real hazards. Don't identify stupid things, and I don't think many people would. But make sure that the hazards are associated to that particular product, and then they are hazards that are realistic for that product. Right, so you also need to identify in your HACCP the methods to control X hazard. So let's go back to E. coli. Alright, the purging process, if it was conducted efficiently, should have been able to purge the animals of E. coli, or being able to test that product while it's in the purging process before it's been sold. Testing goes off to a lab. Lab identifies that the E. coli is either above a specific level or below a specific level. Above a specific level, we might send it off back to purging, or leave them in purging for longer if we don't want to slaughter our stock. Below a certain level, they may say, hey, cool, it's all good, we can sell that product. So that's basically an example of how we can identify a control for a hazard. Just a simple one anyway. So step number 2, or stage number 2, we want to determine a point or a process or a procedure or operational step that can be controlled to eliminate the hazard or minimise their occurrence. Alright, so in that situation of E. coli, we might have a regular testing program for our water supply for that oyster farm, or routine water sampling that occurs around the farm through periods of high flow or periods of heavy rainfall, or upon, oh crap, we actually release some sewage into the water nearby, maybe we should do some testing before you sell your oysters. So that procedure, or that point, is a testing point with a nominal outcome that should be already identified as a critical control point, and it may go on to say, hey, if we pick it up early enough, it's going to be in our stock. Let's not even think about harvesting those animals right now. What can we do to further prevent that into the future? And it may mean, hey, let's turn over our stock faster. It may mean let's look at maybe having a larger purging system where we can hold our animals for longer, where the water's filtered. We can run it through a UV filter or something, for instance, to get rid of E. coli or other bacteria. Right, so that might be embedded into our critical control points as part of our HACCP. Any step within our production cycle, realistically, particularly post-mortem or after death, alright, should have a HACCP associated with it, and in some cases, even when we're feeding livestock, like feeding barramundi, or particularly in aquaculture operations, we would look at what are we actually feeding our fish to prevent further contamination from a contaminated food product. Alright, we need to set the limits. Alright, so back to our E. coli, we might say 100 bacteria units, if we want to call it that, in a particular animal is our limit. And if we go through and we test our purging system, and we might take a sample of 100 animals out before we send them off for consumption, we might say, hey, 100's our limit. We want to actually achieve, you know, less than 0 or less than 30 or something like that, but the limit is 100. Over 100, what do we do with our product? We either hold it to try and run its course, or we may slaughter those animals if it's not capable of, if it's a bacteria that we can't let it run its course, or a virus, for instance, so on and so forth. So realistically, it has to be a trigger point, something that has a number attached to it, so that we can look at it and go, boom, off we go, we're good to go, or we need to act a control point in that. We need to enact on the limit. So there's no point having those limits, alright, if you need to define them. So if we don't define them, in all reality, we don't know where we're going. We're flying blind. Hence why I was just saying a minute ago that we need to define a particular number, or a particular, it might even be just identifying there's a type of bacteria that we don't want. Even if it's one of them, we don't want it in the system. Oops, sorry. Alright, so particular relation to seafood handling are the time and temperature limits that we want to talk about. So over a given period of time, different bacteria will react to different temperatures, but generally speaking, our limit on temperature is 4 degrees. And outside of that 4 degrees, I think we've got around about 2 hours or so on and so forth before it starts becoming a real problem. So if we get our temperatures outside 4 degrees, we need to get them back down below 4 degrees or at 4 degrees as fast as possible. And this all gets documented in a plan which I think we've already given to you guys on Blackboard. It should be an additional hyperlink in there to a salmon HACCP plan out of Canada, which is quite a good one. Right, so stage number 4 is to develop a monitoring system to keep things in control, or at least to understand how things are trending or tracking. All right, so we were using the E. coli outbreak as an example again a minute ago. So, all right, let's routinely sample outside of our farm, maybe upstream, downstream, left and right, who knows, to try and pick up E. coli expansion or growth within the water column outside of the farm. If it's outside of the farm, we might then want to have a reference point on the farm to establish how that works. All right, so for instance, again, another example on establishing a monitoring system might be if we're transporting fish from, you know, a sardine trawler or a longliner boat or whatever it might be. We might put data loggers with temperature, or data loggers with what else do we test for in fish flesh sometimes? Maybe pH or things like that as well. Typically, temperature is the big thing though. If we can track temperature, we can keep the cold chain in check, everything is largely pretty good. So we might look at, in those systems, put those data loggers in at point A, track them through, so we don't actually track them through, it automatically tracks itself through to the endpoint. We take the data points out, we download them to a computer, we plot it out on a chart, and we find out where the temperature spikes occurred. And we might find out that, hey, old mate didn't tell us that he left a truck on the side of the road for 10 hours with a chiller broken down. At that point, we would put those fish into quarantine, have a look at them, test them, find out if we need to discard that stock or whether we can keep it and move on to selling it in the market. Just an example of it anyway. Once again, it's one thing to have it, but it's another thing to enforce it and police it. So the idea behind a HACCP might be to have a food safety officer on site or within your business, or an external seafood safety auditor who monitors your system. You might be ISO accredited or have some external accreditation to do your HACCP program. So it's one thing to have it, but to enforce it is another thing, and it's not worth a pinch of pie if it's not being enforced. In reality, the worst outcome is someone dies from your product and someone says, who audited your HACCP program? And you say, oh, well, we did it internally. Yeah. So having an external audit to do the job for you sometimes has a lot of weight behind it because they're not directly associated with your business. So we just discussed establishing corrective actions, things like quarantining or withholding, allowing things to run its course, maybe even, worst case scenario, probably the last thing you want to be doing is recalling product. But the reality is that in some situations it's better to recall the product than run the risk of actually poisoning someone or having a major outbreak. It's bad for your marketing, it's bad for the industry, and obviously it's bad for the consumer that's actually gotten sick from it. So there's some of your backup plans. Quarantining and so on and so forth, and particularly the recall, and they're really important to have in your plan, for number one, so that you can run emergency budgets, for instance, in all crap, what happens if we do this? Our supplier's not going to be happy that we didn't supply them with enough product. Can we actually purchase our product from somewhere else and on-sell it to fill the gap that we've given? Alright, so stage number 6, and let's zip through and we'll go to stage number 7 as well. Alright, is to establish those procedures in a document that's going to work. It's got to be a living document that's able to be reviewed and acted upon in a similar to the Deming cycle or PDCA, so Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's not the sort of situation when we whack it in place. It's always the same, because we might not always be using the same systems, we might not be using the same staff, we might not be using the same amount of equipment. We might not even be doing the same product in 10 years' time. So the HACCP plan needs to be adaptable, predictive, and it needs to be alive, is probably the term that we talk about. So it has to be able to be reviewed. Alright, so everything needs to be documented. So old mate's off on the table, he's cutting away, he's forgotten to put his armour mesh glove on to stop him from cutting his finger, and he's chopped the top of his finger off, and he's let a whole heap of blood into the product that he's been filleting and he can't find his fingernail. What the hell are we going to do? First off is not to worry about it. You need to document it. You need to tell someone that the process has happened. Old mate's cut his finger off, there's a nail and stuff, there's blood everywhere. Without documenting it, just saying, it happened, let's just take that fish off the shelf, put it away, discard it, whatever it might be, and everything will be forgotten. Alright, if it's not documented, it will be forgotten, and you're not going to be able to adapt your process to handle it. Not effectively and not auditably either. No one's going to be able to come through the system and audit it and say, hey, what happened here? Because it's essentially hidden. So don't hide anything from anybody, because they may be able to find inefficiencies in your system and they might not be able to help you out. So really the core behind a HACCP system is just to protect the integrity of your product, alright, as well as protecting the consumer at the other end from the likes of, obviously bacteria has been heavily discussed in this one, but also physical hazards that may appear, like I've said, knives and cockroaches and all sorts of other insects, so on and so forth. Broken glass, bits of metal shavings, you name it, gets into your products at some stage. And then obviously, at a lesser extent, the things that might occur might be other physical damage, bruising, splitting of the flesh, so on and so forth, as well as the chemical stuff. So how are we going to manage chemical hazards? And a lot of that comes down to standard operating procedures, and we will be discussing that in another video later down the track. Alright, so if anybody's got any questions, don't hesitate to give us a call or flick me an email, or whoever your lecturer might be, and we'll discuss what's going on. Bye for now.